Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'll be delivering both the Washington Report and the call to action this week. Let's get right to it. The House is out this week and the Senate is in for a short week. It will break after Wednesday's votes for the Juneteenth holiday on Thursday. Then both houses will return next week before taking off the following week for the 4th of July recess. Last week in the House came back Monday and took up and passed 3 bills under suspension of the rules. The measures included 2 aimed at denouncing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. Interestingly, one of the measures received 400 votes in favor and no votes against, while the other measure passed by a vote of 280 to 113, with all 113 no votes coming from Democrats. On Tuesday, the House passed a rule providing for floor consideration of 4 bills and a technical corrections measure to change some of the details of the previously passed H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Just for those of you who, like me, are sticklers for detail, you might find it interesting to learn that one of the changes made in several places in the bill was to strike the 2 words intelligence and surveillance and replace them with the single word surveillance. I asked a House Republican leadership staffer what was the difference legislatively between intelligence, surveillance and surveillance, and I was reminded that the Intelligence Committee did not receive any instructions from the budget resolution, and consequently leaving the word intelligence in the text of the measure would mean that it violated the rules of the reconciliation process. And that would mean that the measure would lose its privileged status in the Senate, which in turn would mean that it was subject to filibuster. So they had to remove the word intelligence from several places in the text to make sure it complied with reconciliation rules so it could maintain its privileged status in the Senate. Then the House took up and passed H.R. 2096, the Protecting Our Nation's Capital Emergency Act, and H.R. 884, to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia, and to repeal the Local Residents Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022. That measure passed by a vote of 266 to 148. With 56 Democrats crossing party lines to vote with the majority, and not a single Republican voting to allow non-citizens to vote in local elections in the District of Columbia. On Wednesday, the House passed the rule governing floor consideration of H.R. 4, the Rescissions Act. On Thursday, the House took up and passed S. 331, the Halt Fentanyl Act. Then the House took up H.R. 4, the Rescissions Act, about which we will speak more in a moment, and passed it by a vote of 214 to 212 to 6. Then, after defeating a Democrat-offered motion to adjourn, the House took up and passed H.R. 2056, the District of Columbia Federal Immigration Compliance Act. And then they were done. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to confirm Brett Schuman to serve as an Assistant Attorney General. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of David Fotoy to serve as Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to end debate on and then to confirm the nominations of Stephen Vaden to serve as Deputy Secretary of Agriculture and Andrew Hughes to serve as Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of former Congressman Billy Long to serve as Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Then the Senate voted to end debate on an amendment to S. 1582, the Genius Act, followed by votes to kill 2 resolutions prohibiting arms sales to the Middle East, specifically arms sales to Qatar and arms sales to the United Arab Emirates. On Thursday, the Senate voted to confirm Billy Long to serve as IRS Commissioner. Then the Senate took up a number of amendments and motions related to S. 1582, the Genius Act, and then they were done. This week in the Senate will return Monday with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the motion to end debate on the nomination of Gary Andres to serve as an Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services. Then, based on the Majority Leader's cloture filings, I anticipate we'll see votes on passage of S. 1582, the Genius Act, and on the following nominations: Gary Andres, who we just talked about a moment ago; Olivia Trusty, to serve as a member of the Federal Communications Commission for the remainder of the term expiring June 30, 2025, and then a separate vote on the nomination of Olivia Trusty to serve as a member of the Federal Communications Commission for a term of 5 years from July 1, 2025. Now to the latest on illegal immigration and border security. There are really 3 stories this week on the illegal immigration/border security front: the protests in Los Angeles and the conflict between President Trump and California Democrat government officials over President Trump's decision to federalize the California National Guard to deploy 4,000 National Guard troops over the objections of the state's governor; California Senator Alex Padilla's decision to interrupt a Kristi Noem press conference without identifying himself until he was being forcibly removed from the room and handcuffed; and President Trump's late-week decision to refocus ICE deportation efforts away from the agricultural sector and the hospitality sector, and instead toward urban inner-city areas. First, let's talk about the president's decision to deploy the National Guard over the objections of California Governor Gavin Newsom. Though instances of a president deploying the National Guard over the objections of a state's governor are rare, they are not unprecedented. In fact, the last 2 times it happened was when Democrat presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson gave orders to federalize and deploy the National Guards of Mississippi and Alabama, respectively, to enforce federal civil rights law. The last time the National Guard was called out for riot control in Los Angeles was 1992, when then California Governor Pete Wilson asked then President George Herbert Walker Bush to deploy the National Guard to help him restore order after LAPD officers were found not guilty in the beating of Rodney King. California Democrat elected officials continue to insist that there was no problem there they couldn't handle on their own, even as we continued to see images of burning cars. And then Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass imposed a nighttime curfew on Los Angeles. And that kind of ended that. Later in the week, Alex Padilla, California's senior United States Senator, entered a room where DHS Secretary Kristi Noem was conducting a press conference. Without identifying himself and without any identifying markings on him, including his member's pin, which everyone in Washington regularly sees and which security details recognize, that's the point of wearing the pin, Padilla interrupted the secretary and began demanding answers to questions he had. When he was approached by members of her security detail, he would not stand down, and he would not quiet down. They began moving him out of the room. Now, Padilla is a big man. He's 6'3" tall, and he looks like he could easily weigh 225 pounds, like an NFL linebacker. In full view of Padilla's staff, which conveniently was videotaping the entire incident, he was forced out of the room, taken down to the ground, and then handcuffed. That's where the video I saw ended. I don't know how long he was down, and I don't know how long he was cuffed. But it couldn't have been very long because shortly after the episode, he and Noem had a conversation that lasted 15 minutes. He was never arrested. And then the commentary began, and it was predictable. MSNBC was demanding someone's resignation or incarceration, while MAGA was calling for Padilla to be punished for his rudeness and the threat he posed to Nome. By week's end, temperatures had returned to room temperature. On a separate track, lots of influential people close to President Trump in the business world have been telling him his deportation efforts are going to hurt their businesses, reported the New York Times. And his Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, also told him about the effect the ICE raids were having on the agricultural sector, according to Axios, where one recent study revealed that more than 40% of the workers are illegal aliens. So President Trump posted to his social media account a directive to government forces to shift their attention away from the agricultural and hospitality sectors of the American economy. Some in MAGA world became confused, so he revised his language to urge ICE to focus on conducting raids in the inner city sections of major urban areas, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, all of which are controlled by Democrats. It's still relatively early in the second Trump administration. There's plenty of time for this to be settled. Now let's talk about that rescissions package. H.R. 4, the Rescissions Act, passed the House last week by a vote of 214 to 212 to 6. 1 minute before the vote was closed, the vote stood at 210 in favor, 214 opposed, 8 not voting. Once again, Speaker Johnson pulled a rabbit out of a hat. He got 2 of the Republicans who had not yet voted to cast their votes in support, and, more importantly, he got 2 of the Republicans who had cast their votes against the measure to flip their votes from no to yes. And the moment those vote switches had been properly recorded, the leadership did what leadership does in such a circumstance. It closed the vote and announced the results: passage of the Rescissions Act. One of the switched votes belonged to New York Republican Nick LaLota, who is a key member of the SALT caucus. He said he used his vote to get a conversation with Speaker Johnson to assure himself that the quadrupling of the SALT deduction was going to stay in the reconciliation bill, that is, make it through the Senate. The other switched vote belonged to Nebraska Republican Don Bacon, who sits in one of only 3 districts that Kamala Harris won, that was nevertheless won by a Republican candidate for the House. He said he used his time with Speaker Johnson to assure himself that money was going to continue to flow to public broadcasting stations. The Senate will now take up the package, most likely after they return from the 4th of July holiday recess. The Senate will have up until July 18 to consider and pass the package, or it dies. A rescissions package comes with a 45-day expiration date. Now let's talk about the latest on reconciliation. As of this writing, Monday morning, we're still waiting for one Senate committee to send to the Budget Committee its individual title for the reconciliation bill, the Senate Finance Committee. All the other committees have sent in their texts, and there's not really that much there we didn't expect. As of this writing, Monday morning, the Finance Committee was planning to meet with and brief large outside tax coalition groups late this morning, and Chairman Mike Crapo will formally brief Senate Republicans on committee text at a Senate Republican conference meeting later this evening. Should be starting around 6 o'clock. We're expecting that the Finance Committee will send in its text to the Budget Committee today. It's expected that the text will include placeholders for key tax and Medicaid provisions as negotiations continue. 2 of the biggest areas of concern in the reconciliation bill, the quadrupled SALT deduction that passed the House and the Medicaid work requirements that passed the House, will likely need placeholders. On the fight over the SALT deduction, remember, there are no Republican senators who represent big blue states like California, New York, or New Jersey. And consequently, there are no Republican senators whose constituents are demanding that they find a way to restore the state and local tax deduction that was removed in the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the TCJA. And that means that when Republican members of the Senate Finance Committee look at the tax provisions of the reconciliation bill that came over from the House, they see that SALT deduction going up from $10,000, where it was set in 2017, to $40,000, and they look at its cost. That change to the cap level would reduce revenues flowing into the Treasury by $377 billion over the next decade. And they say to themselves, wow, that's a big number, and it represents money from my constituents in fill-in-the-blank low-tax red state going to people who make a lot more money living in places like California and New York and New Jersey. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, tax policy-wise. And then they look over at the House, and they see a half dozen representatives who say they'll vote to tank the entire bill if they don't get what they want on this front. And they have to be wondering, just how serious are those guys? On the Medicaid side, the pressure in the House is coming from the other side of the conference, from the House Freedom Caucus. So even though several Republican senators have indicated that they're concerned about cutting Medicaid, they have to take into account conservatives in the House who say they'll vote to tank the legislation if it doesn't address their concerns over Medicaid. Plus, there's also a whole bunch of conservatives in the Senate GOP conference who want to reduce spending by even more. And they know Medicaid is a good place to do it, just because that's where the money is. We did get confirmation this morning of something I'd reported to you several weeks ago. The REINS Act, that is the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, will be struck from the reconciliation bill because of the Byrd Rule. Though its enactment would save, over the long run, tens or possibly even hundreds of billions of dollars, saving money is not its principal purpose. Shifting authority away from unaccountable bureaucrats and back to accountable elected members of Congress is. And that means it's a policy change, not a revenue change. And that means it fails the Byrd Rule test, as I predicted it would. Stay tuned. Now to the latest from the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 124 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped Tuesday of last week because it was a special episode. It featured Jenny Beth's webinar conversation with Wade Miller of Citizens for Renewing America from a few days earlier, in which the two went into a deep dive on how President Trump is working with congressional Republicans to make the DOJ spending cuts permanent. They break down key budget mechanisms like rescission, reconciliation, and even pocket rescissions, about which you will be hearing more in August. If you're concerned about our $37 trillion national debt and want to understand how fiscal conservatives can finally make progress reining in the federal budget, this deep dive is a must listen. And that's our Washington Report for this week. Now to the call to action. Actually, like last week, we should call these multiple calls to action. There's still a lot going on in Congress now, and we need your help on multiple fronts. You'll be able to find the details on all this stuff on the front page of our website at teapartypatriots.org. That's teapartypatriots.org. There you'll find a slider that will take you to a page with all kinds of detail. But here's the general outline. We still need your help urging the Senate to move forward and move faster on confirming Trump nominees. We need your help in urging the Senate to strengthen the One Big Beautiful Bill Act the way we've discussed over the last few weeks. You'll find details on the webpage. We need your help in urging the Senate to pass the rescissions package. It's done in the House, waiting for the Senate. That's our broadcast for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Please take a moment to share this broadcast with your Facebook friends and post it to your other social media accounts. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. Until then, be well and be active.